if you don't mind sending it to him about a minute after 2 now. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Danny Lauderdale, Area Specialized Agent for Nursery and Greenhouse for the Eastern region, and glad to see everybody on today. As I've said before, I think I figured out who most everybody is on here. But if for some reason you have a strange string of numbers and don't have your video on, so I can't tell who you are, type your name in the chat so I can get you recorded on the learning management system. Today we've got Joe Neal with us from the Horticulture Department to talk about pre-emergent herbicide use in container and field production nurseries. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to Joe, and thank you for doing this for us, Joe.
All right, thanks very much. I'm going to go ahead and do the share screen. Let me just make sure I get to the correct screen. Okay, everybody seeing my main screen now? Pre-emergent weed control in container and field-grown nursery crops? I got a thumbs up. Okay, good. All right, excellent. Well, Danny asked me to focus on some of the principles of pre-emergence weed control, and we're going to do sort of the high view of both container and field-grown nursery crops, and hopefully I can move through this quickly enough that we'll have time for questions at the end and maybe some discussion about any particular points that you or any questions that you have. Okay, so in looking at the two cropping systems, and this is something that is important from a weed control perspective, more so than other pest management issues, and that is to understand that these are two very different production systems. And so in containers and field nurseries, even though we have a lot of the same herbicides available, we have different weeds. And in fact, in container nurseries, we really only have about 20 weeds, that we're dealing with on a regular basis. But in field nurseries, it's any weed that could possibly be in the soil there. So we're dealing with not just a higher diversity of weeds, but we're different growth habits, different life cycles, perennials, or creeping perennials, rhizomatous perennials, tuberous perennials that we're not going to deal with in containers. In containers, we're really reliant on pre-emergence herbicides, not quite so much so in field nurseries, although we do encourage growers to use their pre's as a standard weed management practice, but we have the option of directed applications of post-emergence herbicides to control some weeds that are not well controlled by the pre-emergent program, or in particular to control some of those perennial weeds. In both systems, we have lots of herbicides to choose from. A lot of them are the same herbicides, but in field nurseries, we have a few additional options that just don't work or are too injurious to use in containers. Also in containers, of course, we prefer granular formulations, although liquids are an option. Most growers prefer the granular treatments. In field nurseries, it's rare to use a granular application. We use almost all spray applications. In containers, because of the unique production system, we also have very short residuals for the herbicides, and we need 4 to 6 applications a year. In field nurseries, because we're in soil, the herbicides don't degrade as rapidly, so we can get by with 2, sometimes 3 applications are needed to get full season weed control. As I said before, in field nurseries, if the weeds break through, we have post-emergence herbicides we can use. Containers, we don't have that, so we're reliant on hand weeding to get any weeds that are not well controlled by the pre-emergence program. And of course, in containers, we have a much higher cost. The products we're using are more expensive. We're using more of them, but the crop itself has a higher unit value as well, in terms of unit being an acre of nursery crop. Versus field nurseries, we're really looking at ways to decrease the overall cost of the weed management plan. So let's start with containers. So we've got to control weeds in containers because weeds compete with the crops, but they also interfere with the quality or perceived quality of the crop as well. We rely heavily on pre-emergence herbicides, broad spectrum granular products that combine both broadleaf and grass herbicide control in a single application. We'll do 3 to 6 applications per year, depending upon the crop and the philosophy of the grower. And the timing of those applications really start with, when do you start your crop, when do you pot? And then there's a seasonality as well to look at what the primary weeds are during that particular season of the year. And we need to rotate our herbicides to match up with the crop cycle, but also with the weed cycle as well. Okay, then supplement with hand weeding. And there are a few post-emergence herbicides that we can use, but they're very rarely used in container nurseries. Okay. As I said, there are lots of herbicides available, and I'm not going to go through every one of them because, you know, that's all. We could be here for a week going through every single herbicide. But let's just look at it this way. We have broad spectrum herbicides and quite a few of them to choose from, and there are a few narrower spectrum products as well. But so it really boils down to, how do I choose the best ones for the particular situation? Well, you ask yourself, well, where are you going to control the weeds? Are you controlling them in the crop, or are you controlling them around the nursery? Are you controlling in liner production or larger containers? Is it a covered house or uncovered house? You know, is this a newly potted plant, or is it an established plant that's already been in the pot for 8, 10, 24 weeks? Okay, then of course the type of crop, and then are there any special warnings on product labels we need to be concerned about? So we're just going to walk through those. One, we got to control the weeds in the crop, but also in the nursery and the area surrounding the crop, because the weeds that are growing in the gravel areas or near your crop are very soon going to be the weeds in your crop. As you can see here, all of those containers on the edge of this bed are heavily infested with spotted spurge. How did that happen? All of these pots got the same dose of herbicide. Okay, there's herbicide on all of those pots, but the reason for the spurge in these was movement from the roadway, and you can see the weeds in the roadway there. They've been sprayed with Roundup, so they're dying, but before they did, they shot their seeds. And spotted spurge will shoot its seed at least 2 feet. Other weeds have the ability to disperse their seeds even further. And so any weed in close proximity to your crop is your next crop weed as well. So how do we go about doing this? Pre-emergence products that have been performing well in these gravel areas in the nurseries include SureGuard, and it's sometimes tank mixed with Barricade, because SureGuard is not that great on grasses, but usually it's a SureGuard glyphosate combination or a Marengo treatment. And it's a good idea to rotate those applications. We don't do these on a 5 or 6, on a 6 to 8 week cycle. We'll treat this as though it's a field situation, and we expect to see several months of residual control from these products. Now, if you happen to be in a nursery that's growing a lot of tender herbaceous stock, you may want to use something like Gallery Barricade. It's actually labeled for use in a lot of herbaceous plants, but if there happened to be some spray drift or some movement, splashing from the gravel into the crop area, you have a much less chance of getting any crop injury if you use a product that is actually sort of labeled for use around those crop plants. Okay. The one thing you want to make sure your growers don't do is don't use industrial type residual products, right? Um, every few years we get some sales reps that don't quite understand their products as well as they should, and they promote some things like Arsenal or Sahara for weed control in roadways around nurseries. Any of these, bare ground type industrial products can result in damage, specifically as you see in this photograph, as water moves from that roadway and into the production bed, we get root uptake by the crop. And this photo in the corner there, that is, you see those little buds there? This is not early spring. This is midsummer, and those buds are the full growth for that year. That compacta ollie is not going to grow this year. It may not grow next year. So essentially, if you get these kinds of products in your crop, you basically just have to throw your crop out. Okay. So we got to make sure that growers just don't do that. Another weed that we see a lot, and I'm going to use the term weed sort of loosely here, is nostoc. And nostoc is not actually a plant, it's a cyanobacterium. Most probably this is Nostoc commune, but of course, since it doesn't have a flower, we can't really key it out. We'd have to send it off for genetic testing to identify the species, and we've not been able to do that yet. But the nostoc forms gelatinous masses on the gravel or the ground cloth as a slipping hazard to employees. Okay, it's actually, there was some information circulated a few years ago that it might produce toxins, human toxins, but as it turns out, this particular nostoc is actually consumed in the Orient in salads. I think once they grow it and then they dry it down and then use it in salads. Looks a little, when it's dried down, it looks a little bit like seaweed. Okay, but when it's growing on the gravel or on the ground cloth, is a very hazardous, very hazardous for employees when they're walking and moving and working on these areas. Our current sanitation practices clearly are not controlling this organism. So we've done, and it's becoming more and more common throughout the country in nurseries. So we've done some experiments, and just give you a real quick look at some of the results. That's our non-treated and what it looks like midsummer. We use diquat, which is used an algicide for aquatic systems, and it just caused a little bit of discoloration of it, but did not control it. Similarly, some other people have suggested that sanitizing peroxide type sanitizing agents like Green Clean Pro, long chain fatty acids, Scythe has been reported to work. Well, this is what it looks like when we treat with Green Clean Pro or with Scythe. In other words, maybe a few bits of it have discolored, but the rest of it of the nostoc is doing just fine. Okay, but we have found a few things that do work. If you've worked in golf turf, you know that occasionally cyanobacteria become problems on golf greens, and they've used manzate or mancozeb. And in this case, you can see we did get some suppression. This was only 12 days in. By another month after this, we had quite a bit of regrowth. And in golf turf, when they use manzate, they do it preventatively on a 14-day cycle throughout the entire season. So of course, we really would rather not have to do that. Some growers have been having some success with this product called SA20. It's a sanitizing agent from Southern Ag, and in about 2 weeks after application, this is what it looks like. But if you continue with some reapplications over the course of the season, you can start to see a decrease in the nostoc. One of the better treatments in our studies is not registered right now, but is a copper compound. In fact, we're looking at several different copper compounds that seem to have some promise in controlling it. This is what it looked like 21 days after our first application. We had 65% control with our copper compound Captain, but only 40% with a different copper compound. And the SA20, we had about 40%, and Manzate 53. Later in the season, this grew back. But again, Green Clean Pro, Scythe, and Reward were all essentially zero control. We did have another treatment that looked very promising in our studies, Diuron. Here's the area that was treated with Diuron. And this was an area that was treated with Simazine. Now, the first year we did it, the Simazine looked just like this. It looked perfect. I mean, it looked like the Diuron plot here. The Simazine plot looked clean, but in this next season, we got essentially no control. So Simazine was variable. The Diuron was more consistent. And that's part of a national research project right now to try and see if we can get some of these products registered. So the question is, if you got growers that have nostoc now, what can we right now advise them to do? Well, one product that is currently available and labeled for use in nursery settings is the SA20 sanitizing agent, and it does have some activity. It will require multiple applications, but it seems to have some promise for at least suppressing the nostoc, and if you don't have a real heavy infestation, it might be the type of product that can clean up small patches. In heavier infestations, what we found is if you scrape this surface, you don't have to scrape it all off. You just have to disturb it with a box blade, like you're smoothing the gravel out. If you do that and then apply Simazine at 1 to 1.5 quarts per acre, we were getting really good control about half of the time. So I don't know why it worked one time and did not work the next. Likely it's due to some factors such as the amount of rainfall or amount of irrigation or something after the application. But because these are on-farm experiments, we really don't have tight control over exactly what's falling, and the site does not have a weather station, so we've not been able to really nail that down. All these other options I showed you in sort of a research update, they're looking promising, so I'm hoping we'll have some different options in the coming years, because we have some treatments that are looking good. But let's get back to more traditional weed control. Again, we've talked about what to do around the nursery in terms of sanitation. What about in the crop itself? Well, we got to think about the crop itself. Are we growing liners, or are we growing larger plants? So in liner production, we can use some herbicides, okay, but we got to be very careful because these plants are tiny. They have tiny root zones. They're not well established. So in liner production, on the rooted cuttings, we can use some pre-emergence herbicides that are not root inhibitors. Okay, so Ronstar, Regal 00 do not inhibit root growth. Pennant Magnum doesn't inhibit root growth, it inhibits shoot growth. So we can use these on some of the crops if once they're already rooted. But of course, we've also got to be careful not to burn the foliage, because these products also can burn the foliage. So it's really sort of difficult to get the timing just right, because the foliage has to be dry. You can then have to wash the herbicide off before the granules can stick and cause damage to the foliage. But there are a lot of propagators who use these products on a regular basis. These products that don't inhibit root growth may also be good choices for your first application when you take these young rooted cuttings and transplant them into a larger pot, when you want to be getting those roots established. And that's crucial in the early phases of production, is to get the roots off to a good start, and and the tops will follow, right? So these products, I often recommend them in that first application at transplanting when you're using a small liner in particular. Okay. Well, a lot of our liners are produced in covered houses, right? So what can we do in covered houses? Well, sanitation, because in a covered house, we cannot treat the crop with a pre-emergence, but we can treat the ground and around and the foundation around the covered house with a residual herbicide such as SureGuard or Marengo. Okay, monobor is also labeled for use in houses, but it's basically it's a chlorine borate type salt, and it moves with the water. So if your crop is sitting right on the ground like this one, you do run a chance of having some salts that could move and with your capillary action. So that's something to remember, right? But the SureGuard and the Marengo can be applied before the crop goes into the house, right? SureGuard needs 24 hours after application and in irrigation. Marengo can be applied and then the crop can go right into the house shortly thereafter. And of course, we do have post-emergence herbicides to clean up emerged weeds in the house. But if you've got an older prop house that has a history of some bittercress and oxalis and that sort of thing, it's a good idea to clean it up before the crop goes in. And part of that cleanup process is to put down a pre-emergent such as SureGuard or Marengo to prevent those weeds from getting into the liners. Because once it's in the liner, you start transplanting it, you've got it in your finished crop. So start clean and stay clean with that. So what about that finished crop? Well, if you're growing hollies or arborvitae or these tough woody plants, we've got lots of different herbicides that we could use. We got liquid products, we have granular products, and they're all very broad spectrum. So lots of products to choose from. Where does it make a difference though? Okay, in terms of choosing a product, it might be based on the size of the crop when you start out. Remember, I mentioned when you start out with a very young or a small liner, a small rooted cutting, sometimes you want to use a pre-emergence that is not a root inhibitor. It goes beyond that as well because Broadstar is not a root inhibitor. Freehand does have a root inhibitor in it, but the tower portion of that is not a root inhibitor. But they both damage seedling wax myrtles. So a typical production cycle for the wax myrtle is to start with a seedling in May. Right, so you start with this young seedling, and I know one of the main producers in North Carolina produces their seedlings in 96 cell trays. So these are little tiny transplants, and a grower will take that and put that transplant directly into a 3-gallon pot. Okay, so it's a very small liner in a very big, relatively big pot. Okay, if you use Broadstar or Freehand on it, you will kill that seedling initially, right? But if you use a different herbicide such as an OH2 or a Regal 00 at that time, get the seedling established, 8 weeks later you can come back in with a Freehand application and there will be no damage. So that's something with these young transplants. There are a few plants that are very sensitive. Now there was a time when I got some wax myrtle transplants out of Florida. They were rooted cuttings and they were very woody. They had very woody stems, and we did not see that damage. All right, so it's all about the age and the size of those plants at the time of transplant. We see that with herbaceous plants as well. A lot of growers are going with smaller and smaller plugs to start their herbaceous plants, and those young little plugs are quite sensitive to herbicides. Okay. There is also another example, azaleas. If you get young rooted cuttings of azaleas, they can be damaged by our dinitroaniline herbicides like like pendimethalin, arizoline, and prodiamine or barricade. Whereas if you just let them get established for 8 to 10 weeks, then that would be your second round of herbicides can include the dinitroanilins. Okay. Now, the type of crop obviously is going to make a difference. Whether you're growing herbaceous plants or woody plants or trees or shrubs, that will change the products that you have available. So for example, if you're growing herbaceous perennials, we have very few herbicides that are safe, okay? Overall, all of the trials that I've run, Pendulum 2G has often been the safest of the pre-emergence herbicides, and I recommend anybody that is growing herbaceous perennials and they think they might want to use a pre-emergence herbicide, if they've not done it before, I recommend Pendulum 2G, okay, because it's going to be safe on just about everything they're growing. It may not be the greatest weed control, but it's going to be safe on their crop, and it will decrease the amount of spurge they have to deal with. It'll control crabgrass and several others. Okay. Now, Snapshot is widely used in herbaceous perennial production, but it can injure quite a few, very common species like Stachys on the left-hand side of the screen, Phlox paniculata, and in the lower right-hand side of the screen, you can see a dianthus. Now, the plant on the left is the non-treated. The plant on the right was treated with the labeled rate of Snapshot. So the plant looked like it was healthy. If you didn't have the non-treated next to it, you might just think that somebody substituted the variety Pixie for your production. But, it stunted the growth of that plant significantly. So sometimes the injury can be rather stealthy. That it's not obvious. It's not burning the leaves. It's not causing dieback. It's just slowing the growth down. Okay. Well, where do you get this information about what you can use, what you can't use? We've got these charts and tables that I put together. They're all on my website. On a table like this, you can see, well, if I'm growing yarrow, well, I've got lots of herbicides available. If I'm growing acarus, well, there's only 3 herbicides that are registered. And this one says D, that means directed applications only. If you can figure out how to do a directed application to acarus without contacting the foliage, I want to hear from you. It's basically ground cover type plant, so that's a little bit silly, I think. But Preen Southern is a dimension granular formulation, and this, of course, is just an excerpt of the table. So, particularly growers who are doing herbaceous perennial production, this table is very useful and helpful to figure out what they can and cannot use. Okay, what about woodies? We have lots of different herbicides available. OH2 route biathlon, they all contain oxyfluorophane and a dinitroaniline. There's Broadstar, there's Snapshot, there's Freehand, there's Marengo, there's Fuerte is the newest one that contains some Broadstar and some Barricade. How do you choose? Well, focus first on safety, right? OH2 route and biathlon are basically safe on most of our woody crops. They've been in the industry for 35, 40 years, right? Broadstar and Marengo are newer, can be a little rough on very young plants, but are safe on larger plants, on conifers. Snapshot, Gemini, Fortress, Freehand, they're a little bit safer than on plants in that they don't burn the foliage if the granule gets stuck to it. But their weed control spectrum is generally not quite as broad as the ones above. So those are just some rules of thumb about what's safe. How do you know that? Of course, yes, we have a table for that. I'm not going to go into any details here, but if you wanted to dig in and find out, okay, I've got a grower that's growing Pieris and he's wondering what herbicides he could use, this can give you a starting point. Go to these charts, see what herbicides are labeled for use on Pieris, and that's your starting point to start to figure out what's possible. Where do you get them? Obviously on my portal under this blue tab right there that says herbicides, and that's where you'll find herbicide fact sheets, fact sheet on every herbicide that's labeled in nurseries. Okay, I haven't done them all yet, but I've got most of them done. So you can get a fact sheet on every herbicide that describes what it is, what it controls, what rates of application to recommend, what weeds are not controlled, and some additional information. Uh, Also, at this site, you'll get the pre-emergence, post-emergence herbicide efficacy charts, products that are labeled for woody and herbaceous ornamentals, both pre and post-emergence. So again, selecting the best herbicide is first, safety to crop, but then second, which one is going to give you the best weed control for that time of year? Okay, so of the products that are safe, now we can start looking for which ones are going to control the weeds that are important to me right now, right? So for example, you'll often have what we in weed science often refer to as the driver weeds, the weed species that drive your decision making, okay? Bittercress. Bittercress is going to be your most common weed in cool season production. So whatever you choose, for that time of year, it really ought to be a pretty good product for bittercress. In the summertime, you're going to have spurge. And what you use in the summertime really ought to be one of these products that controls spurge quite well. Okay, Freehand, Tower, Marengo, Broadstar. You notice that for spurge, we don't list the oxyfluorophan products. We don't list OH2, biathlon, route. Do they have activity on spurge? Yes, but not nearly as good as these other products. Again, in the summertime, some growers will have phyllanthus. Okay, and if you've got phyllanthus, then the order changes. Broadstar is going to be better than the freehand or the Marengo on phyllanthus, but that doesn't mean freehand doesn't work on phyllanthus. All right, it just means that Broadstar is going to be a little better. If you have Eclipta, we don't have good options for Eclipta, period. Okay, Freehand has been the most consistent product year in and year out, and we're lucky to get 50% control. Okay, 1 year Marengo worked quite well, and then 5 years in a row it did not work well. So all the other products were relatively poor weed control of Eclipta. Marsh parsley is a cool season weed, and the only herbicide we have that seems to work on it is Freehand. Okay, so if you got marsh parsley, you think, okay, well, I want to use Freehand or Tower. But marsh parsley is a cool season weed. What's your number one cool season weed? Bittercress. Do you see Freehand or Tower on that list for bittercress? No, it's not very good on bittercress. Well, I take that back. In the wintertime, it's not as good as the oxyfluorophan. So here's where you have to make a judgment call. Bittercress is going to cost you a lot of money to hand weed. Marsh parsley is a lot easier to hand weed. It's slow to develop. It doesn't go to seed very quickly. So you've got time to deal with marsh parsley and clean it up before it becomes a serious problem. Versus bittercress, that's a lot more a headache for the hand weeding crew. So in this case, that's where I would say, okay, we recognize that the marsh parsley is not going to be controlled by our pre-emergence herbicide program with oxyfluorophan. Okay, but we also have to say, well, our most important weed is going to be controlled, and now we need to manage the marsh parsley through other means, and that's going to be through hand weeding. Now, this also illustrates, I think, that at different times of year, you have different weeds that you need to think about. That means you're going to use different herbicides and rotate your herbicide applications to match up with the important weeds at that time of year. So part of that rotation has to remember that there are restrictions on the number of treatments that we can recommend. So for example, for dimethenamid P, which is Tower or Freehand, prodiamine, which is Barricade, flumioxazin, which is SureGuard, Broadstar, or the new product Fuente. Excuse me, I'm getting all tongue-tied on that one. And the other one on this list is Indaziflam, which is Marengo. Those you only get 2 applications per year at the normal use rate. Oxaflorphan, azoxaben, you get 3 applications per year at the normal use rate. So that means if you're using Snapshot, you could do 3 applications of Snapshot. You could do 1 application of Snapshot, 1 application of Gemini, 1 application of Fortress, and you've used all of the azoxaben you're allowed to use that year, right? So you've got to think about how are you going to build these rotational plans and strategies for the growers. And we'll look at the, here are a couple of examples for daylily production. Some of the growers that I've worked with usually transplant their daylilies in late summer, getting ready for spring market. And so let's say our first application's at potting in August. So August 1, what kind of weeds are growing in August? Well, it's still hot. We're going to have spurge all over the place. Freehand is going to work better on spurge than Snapshot or Gemini, okay? Once we get into October, November timeframe, bittercress is going to be more of an issue. So we'll come back with a Snapshot or a Gemini application or a Fortress application in the second round, maybe, and the third round. Then coming out of winter, we could go back to the freehand application, and hopefully by that time we're shipping the plants out, right? Now, if you wanted a liquid option, you can follow the same kind of scenario, because Snapshot and Gemini are basically Gallery plus a dinitroanolin herbicide. Tower is a sprayable formulation of one of the active ingredients of freehand. And you can follow that same type of rotational plan with a liquid application. But we align these treatments with the predominant and most costly weeds for that season. Now, if you're doing woody production, you have a lot more options in front of you, and your starting point of when you do the transplanting will also affect which herbicide rotation you choose. And these are just 4 of many, many different rotations, because shrub roses, we have, you know, just about every pre-emergence herbicide is labeled for use on shrub roses. Okay, the one thing that I would say for shrub rose, in particular knockout rose production, is you do not want to have broad star as your application just as they're coming out of winter dormancy. When they're coming out of winter dormancy, the root system is pulling a lot of water out of the substrate. And it seems like if we have broadstar applied right at that time, there's a flush of flumioxazin gets absorbed by the roots and pushed up into the new foliage, and we get necrotic tissues. Now, if that happens, it's really not the end of the world, because all you got to do is go through and do a pruning, and then the next flush comes out normally with no damage whatsoever. And it doesn't seem to stunt the regrowth either. Okay, but that is probably on shrub roses. They're a lot tougher than a lot of people think. Okay, but these are examples that would show where, you know, we start out with something like Biathlon or Ronstar or Regal 00. This is on a newly potted rooted cutting, you know, and start out with one of these quote unquote softer products. A softer product that's going to help that plant get its roots established, and then come back with a more broad spectrum herbicide such as the freehand or the broadstar. And in the summertime, we want the freehand or broadstar for the spurge control, and as we get into the cooler parts of the season, we'll switch back to the oxaflorphan containing products like Biathlon, OH2, Rout, etc. One thing to remember every time we're doing a pre-emergence granular pre-emergence herbicide application in container nursery is that those products need to be applied to dry foliage. And here's a great example. This is ligustrum. I know it's a weed, but it's a crop. And you think ligustrum is this tough plant, hard to damage, but If that foliage is the least bit moist when you put on an application of Broadstar or Fuerte, you're going to get this severe tip dieback symptom. Okay, and that's just the granules getting caught on the foliage and really causing some damage. You see this with most crops, not always quite this dramatic, but you'll see it with OH2 and route and biathlon. You even see it a little bit with snapshot when you apply it to or tender plants like buddleia, hydrangea. You get some tip dieback if the foliage is wet or moist at the time of application. Okay. Now, regardless of what herbicide you're using, it's got to be applied uniformly and accurately. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail other than to say that we have done some work to figure out how best to do this, and the results will surprise you. That the information on the labels isn't always accurate. The calibration trays that the manufacturers give to distributors and growers to use to calibrate their applications are no good for calibrating a spreader because they don't capture the granules as they're applied. The granules actually bounce out of those trays. But more importantly is how to go about using this spreader. And just to summarize it, consistent walking speed, each pass with the spreader needs to be 8 to 10 feet apart, no further than that. Never turn the spreader or change the rudder position, keep it centered the entire time. Wind will throw all the granular application uniformity out the window. It's just, you've got to avoid the wind. And calibrate for a half dose, do it twice down the path. And our original guidelines, were to, you can go down the same path in opposite directions. Okay, so it throws heavier to one side than to the other. Okay, so if you go down the path, it's going to be throwing differentially more herbicide to the right. So you turn right around and come back the same path, and as you're coming back that path, you're going to even out the dose. Okay, and here's some videos that you can use for educational programs to excuse me, to help with your growers on how to use granular applicators correctly. And those are available from my website. Look for the tab on cost-effective weed control in container nurseries, and you'll see we've got calibrating your spreader. We've got how to apply herbicides uniformly, and there's a link also in here to the videos. No matter how good our pre-emergence herbicide program is, there are always going to be weeds coming up, and those have to be controlled by hand in containers, and you want to hand weed frequently to prevent weed spread, right? And this just illustrates, if we were hand weeding every 2 weeks, and this is the amount of weeds we were pulling out. We hand weed when they became weedy at 6 to 8 week intervals before we applied an herbicide, and there's the pile of weeds that come out then. We don't need a whole lot of statistics to show that we're getting rid of a lot of the weeds and keeping them from becoming a problem if we go through more frequently. All right, so in container nurseries, select the right product. We want to treat right after potting with the right product for the safety to that young plant. Retreat on a regular schedule about every 8 weeks, and hand weed frequently to prevent seed production. Okay, and of course, apply the herbicides uniformly and accurately by calibrating. Danny, I'm not able to see the chat window, so please stop me, and if there are any questions in the chat window as we go through here.
Okay, there are none currently, but I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, let's turn our attention to field-grown nursery crops. In a lot of ways, it's a little simpler. Okay, our goal here is not complete weed control. Our goal is really just to prevent weed competition. So a little bit of vegetation out there in the field is not a bad thing. In fact, it is a good thing to keep some vegetation there to protect the plants and protect the soil from erosion. Okay, so a typical nursery weed management plan is to maintain vegetation between the rows for erosion control, but also for your ability to drive in the nursery and get to the crop for other activities such as pruning and spraying and inventory management, but then keep essentially a bare ground within row to prevent competition with the crop. So we're going to keep that essentially bare, but not all weeds are created equal, right? If all you have in that crop row are some chickweed and a little bit of clover, those plants are not competing with your trees that we typically will grow in field nursery settings in North Carolina. Okay, might be a problem with young transplanted boxwoods, but in larger, field-grown stock, the presence of some low-growing winter forbs, they're not competing with your crop. Okay, what the plants that are important, grasses are the most competitive. Summer annual grasses and perennial grasses are the most competitive. Tall broadleaf weeds that might shade your crop, particularly in newly planted crops. So a ragweed that gets up and shades your crop can dramatically affect it. It'll also decreases air movement, so it can increase foliar diseases. It can also be a habitat to harbor, vertebrate pests. All right, and of course, but the worst would be vines like morning glory or bindweed that twine around the plant and then affect the growth of it. So again, summer annuals, very competitive for resources when they are most limiting to the growth of your crop. And vines like morning glory, there is a dogwood in there, but of course, if you've got morning glory in your trees this badly, those trees are going to be so disfigured they would be unmarketable. Okay, so how do we maintain the weed control in the crop rows? What pre-emergent plans? Again, newly planted versus established plants, we have some different guidelines. In newly planted field stock, we can use a pre-emergence application of Gallery plus Pendulum, or Gallery plus Surfland, or Gallery plus Barricade, or even Pennant Magnum or Tower as a directed spray in the crop row for pre-emergence control. Now, most of our trees and our conifers will also tolerate an application of SureGuard or Marengo at planting as well. Okay, so this really all depends on the crop that you're putting in. If you've got new growth, so for example, SureGuard can cause damage to the new growth on hollies. So if you're transplanting some Nellie R. Stevens hollies or some needle points and they've got some new growth on them when you're going to put your pre-emergent out, then you might want to choose one of these other products rather than SureGuard. Okay, but after that Nellie R. Stevens holly has been in the ground for 2 years and you're doing your winter application, the SureGuard can be used. Simazine needs to be avoided on newly planted maples, cherries, and a few other species because you can get stunting and chlorosis from the simazine, particularly on a sandy soil. In an established planting, we can now start to use simazine. Now, why is that important? Well, simazine is an old compound. Okay, it's been around for, been in use by growers for longer than I've been working in this industry. So simazine is a inexpensive pre-emergence herbicide, primarily for broadleaf weed control. We apply that in late winter follow up with another application in early summer for your later germinating weeds, and then again in late summer to control your fall germinating weeds. It's used in combination with a grass herbicide. And this is the standard pre-emergent program for field-grown trees and shrubs because simazine is cheap and effective most of the time. Excuse me. Okay, and then any weeds that do escape could be controlled with a non-selective post-emergence herbicide, right? That is our standard program, but this program can vary. For example, many growers are choosing to use Marengo because Marengo does have a little bit longer residual. So instead of 3 applications per year, they may be able to do 2 applications per year and have the same weed control. SureGuard can be more effective on morning glory. So for example, if you have morning glory in your field in the summertime, then SureGuard might be a better option over simazine for controlling morning glory, because frankly, even though SureGuard is more expensive than simazine, getting out there and hand roguing morning glory out of your fields is a lot more expensive than any herbicide program you're going to use. Now, Amanda and I set up some trials a couple of years ago to ask this question: does Marengo truly last longer? And the answer is yes, it does last longer than simazine. Yes, it does last longer than SureGuard, but only a few weeks longer than SureGuard. The residual is not, for broadleaf weeds in field nurseries, the residual is not that much longer, okay? But it is longer, and for grasses, it lasts quite a long time. In fact, for ryegrass control, it can last for over a year. So it does persist for a while, and it's possible that if you do multiple applications per year, you're going to start building up some residual that would last even longer. What my takeaway from this research was, at higher doses, you're going to get longer residual control with Marengo. So the dose that you choose to apply will make a difference. Okay, but because of that slightly longer residual, you may be able to get by with 2 applications per year versus 3 applications that we normally use. But I will say I've seen it can be weak on morning glory, so it may not. The SureGuard may be a better choice if you're dealing with morning glory in the field. It does not control the nut sedges, so you may want to either supplement that with a tower or a pennant magnum application, or look at an alternative such as a simazine with tower or simazine with metolachlor for those areas where you've got nut sedge, or just plan to come back with a post-emergence nut sedge control. So in-field nursery stocks, of course, we want to get our perennial weeds out before we plant using post-emergence products. We want to choose the correct dose for the crop age. As I was saying, no simazine on the newly planted maples. Use the SureGuard, not when on hollies, not when they're flushing new growth. And of course, as with containers, our field nursery applications need to be applied uniformly and accurately. Now, I want to just point something out, is that to get a uniform and accurate application in a field nursery, you want to go on both sides of the row. Okay, you want to orient the nozzles downward toward the ground with a 15% overlap in the center. Now, this probably seems, so obvious that why am I talking about it, right? Because we've had growers trying to decrease the number of trips through the field, and they oriented their spray nozzles parallel to the ground from one side and tried to spray across the whole width of the of the row. And this has not done as well in terms of the weed control. You always get what's called a spray shadow on the other side of the tree. But more importantly, we've actually measured that we get almost 7 times more herbicide on the stem of the plant when we do it this way. Now, that may not be so important if you're applying simazine and barricade, but if you put in a post-emergence herbicide tank mix with that application, all of a sudden now we're getting bark damage from those treatments. The SureGuard also might cause some bark damage if on young plants if it's applied in this way. All right, so again, right way, wrong way. So if you've got some growers that are trying to do this from one side of the row to treat the whole width, encourage them to get back to a traditional application hitting both sides of the row. Right, so what about in between the rows? Honestly, it's whatever the grower likes to do. If they want to mow it, mow it. If they want to cultivate it, you can cultivate it, but only if the ground is not erodible. And then I would try to get them to do minimal cultivation. You can do a directed application of pre and post in the row. You can also do a post-emergence herbicide between rows to burn the vegetation back. But again, encourage the growers to allow some vegetation to grow in between those rows. What about nut sedge? I mentioned it earlier. If the area, if the field has nut sedge, you want to map these areas so you know which fields have nut sedge and they need a special attention. They need a different herbicide, and you can use Pennant Magnum or Tower. Could use freehand, but it's a granular only, and so typically would only use, typically a field nursery grower would want to use Pennant Magnum or Tower as a directed application, only in those fields where nut sedge has been a problem, right? And this is for yellow nut sedge only. If you've got purple nut sedge, neither Pennant Magnum nor Tower will have any effect on it. You have to do an all post-emergence program for purple nut sedge. Now we do have of course, some post-emergence options for nut sedge control, and I'm sure you have growers who are using Sedgehammer, but technically Sedgehammer is not labeled for nursery use. Certainty, on the other hand, is labeled for use in field nurseries, and this was something that actually surprised a lot of people who work in nursery weed management, because the company never supported any work with the product, but it's labeled for field nurseries. So certainly, also the active ingredient is sulfosulfuron. Is a lot like halosulfuron, but a little hotter. So we would not use it in landscape settings, but as a directed application in field-grown trees, it works basically just like Sedgehammer. There is one other product, Dismiss, that can also be used as a pre or post application for nut sedge. And then, of course, you can clean up emerged yellow or purple nut sedge with glyphosate or with phenale. So again, pre-emergence suppression, I don't call it control, because the best I've ever really been able to do is about 60 to 70% reduction in nut sedge in the field. So always plan on both a pre-emergence and a post-emergence application. And I want to correct something here on this slide. I said selected post with bass ground or Sedgehammer. Sedgehammer is labeled for landscape, not for nursery. This should say certainty. What about resistant weeds? Well, if you'd, I actually gave a presentation just a few years ago at the North Carolina Nursery and Landscape Associations, where I made the statement that it has not been a big issue in North Carolina yet. Well, I have to take that back because we find now that about 80% of the growers now recognize that they have herbicide-resistant weeds, primarily glyphosate-resistant pigweed, horseweed, or ragweed. So this is Palmer amaranth, a pigweed, widespread in the eastern part of the state. Horseweed, we've got basically, if you've got a population of horseweed in a grower's field, you better assume that it is glyphosate resistance now, okay? Ragweed, we have pockets of glyphosate resistant ragweed, primarily on grower fields that are in proximity to larger agronomic producers who are using Roundup Ready cropping systems, okay? But we've got it from the mountains to the coast. And this weed in the upper right-hand corner is a new one. It's called tall water hemp. Historically, this has not been present in North Carolina, but last year was the first documented case, and I took this picture, and it is glyphosate resistant because most of the populations in the Midwest are already glyphosate resistant. It may even have multiple resistance to several different modes of action. So this has just moved into the state. It is a pigweed. It's a little different than the others in that the leaves are long and slender. So if you have something out there that looks like a pigweed, but it's got skinny leaves, we should, take some pictures or take a sample and send them to me, and let's get it identified because this one's a new one. It's likely glyphosate resistant. One of the things that we always advise growers to do if they have glyphosate resistant weeds is to have a good pre-emergence program in place. And we have lots of options for pre-emergence control of these glyphosate resistant weeds. For example, horseweed, Marengo, Surfland, Simazine, SureGuard. That's just a few options that we have available that are all good control options for horseweed. Pigweed, Barricade, Tower, Surfland, Simazine, SureGuard. Our pigweeds are well controlled by these herbicides. Ragweed, Barricade does not work well. Don't have much data on Marengo. We don't think it's as good on ragweed as some of the other weeds. Tower and Surfland, fair control, not as good as Simazine or SureGuard, but I put here Simazine can be good or it can be poor. Now, why not? Why is that? Because we have resistant biotypes of ragweed out there that have been resistant to Simazine since the 1970s. We also have some ryegrass, annual ryegrass throughout the state that's resistant to glyphosate, but we have lots of pre-emergence herbicides that work very well on annual ryegrass. So if you've got growers that have some glyphosate resistant weeds, make sure they have a plan for a pre-emergence program that will control them. And keep weeds in check. It's easier to maintain a field than to clean up a weedy crop. And that goes across whether it's container production, landscape management, or field production. Now, of course, want any more information on weed management, most of the resources are available to you on my portal. And if you haven't visited it, please check it out. And because hopefully I've spent a lot of time putting that information together. I hope it's useful to you. And with that, do we have questions?
Joe, there was one question in the chat from Cliff Ruth. Any thoughts on resistance in American burnweed?
I have not seen any reports of burnweed being resistant to glyphosate, but it is quite tolerant of a number of our pre-emergence herbicides. And it tends to germinate over an extended time. So the seed have a complex dormancy, so you don't get a flush of a bunch of American burnweed all at once. It seems to germinate a little bit at a time throughout the whole season. So I found it to be a little bit tough to control pre-emergence for that reason. But if you're getting it in containers, then our OH2 route, biathlon, Marengo, Broadstar, Freehand have all been good on it. Snapshot, Gemini, Fortress, not quite as good. For post-emergence, I've not had any trouble controlling it. So Cliff, you know, speak up. Have you seen some populations you think might be resistant? That would be good to know.
Seen it around greenhouses on the outside.
Okay.
And spraying with Roundup just spotted it. I mean, you just had spots of burn and not any kind of control.
That's interesting. Well, I'd like to follow up with you on that. You know, after you know, we're a little easier to travel and get around, because that species has not been reported to be herbicide resistant. But certainly, if you see that it's been sprayed and it's not dying, good chance it's got some tolerance. In those situations, the easy switch out there is, of course, triphenale. You know, and it's also labeled for use around greenhouses. So, you know, it's non-volatile, and it should work, but it's not as systemic as glyphosate. So might have to, you know, cut the plants down so that you can get a good coverage on the regrowth. But keep me posted on that. If you you continue to see that, please please bring me back into the loop on it.
Are there any other questions for Joe?
Okay.
All right, hearing none, I would ask that whoever's identifier name, it starts with ZXIA, if you will either unmute and let me know who you are, or put your name in the chat so I can put you on the learning management system for credit for today. And being that we are over an hour now, Joe, I'll just ask, do you have any other final thoughts?
Nope. I think I've spoken enough for today.
All right, so we will wrap it up. I don't know if Amanda wants to say anything, but I know she has a poll out looking at some dates. I think it was in November for the next one of these Zoom training sessions. So any comments, Amanda?
Yeah, well, we don't have a specific date yet, but we'll have our next one of these will be early November with Brian Jackson. He'll be talking about substrates. So stay tuned for the announcement on that.
Okay, very good. Thanks everybody for coming. Joe, thank you for recording it. If you'll get that to Brandon and let me know when he has it up, I'll send out an email with a link to everybody.
Will do. Thank
Okay.
you all.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.